Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to late 16th century Korea. The lights are dim. The tea is cooling by your bedside. We're going to float along a coastline where the water folds over itself like silk. We're going to meet an admiral who did nearly everything right and was nearly executed for it, 'cause of course he was. Let's settle in with Admiral Yi Sun. He's a name that tends to show up on lists. Greatest admirals ever. Unbroken record. Savior of a kingdom. But the reality is quieter and more uncertain around the edges. He had bad joints sometimes. He worried about his mother. He didn't sleep well. He wrote in his diary about headaches and tides, the way you or I might write about the weather, because for him, the weather was a living animal that could decide a battle. His talent for planning was obvious. His talent for surviving palace, politics a bit less so. To understand why he was nearly punished to death before becoming a legend, we have to float upstream a little, into the slender channels of his early career, where every turn seems to catch on a sandbar of somebody else's. Pride. Yu was born into a Yangban family, respectable but not glittering, with more bookcases than money and more duty than comfort. He was clever and he was tough. The kind of tough that comes from long practice, not from posing. He took the military examinations, which had an awkward habit of evaluating horsemanship by making candidates do complicated things while still on the horse. On one attempt, he fell, fractured a leg, and watched his prospects crumble for a time as the examined the horse, presumably moved on. He came back a few years later, older, still limping a little, and passed. It felt less like a triumph and more like finally being allowed to get on with it. His first postings were in the north, along the Jurchen frontier. It was cold enough to bite, and the administration there was what you might politely call aspirational. He repaired walls. He drilled men. He refused bribes in a way that was widely admired and privately resented. That was a theme with him. He made enemies by insisting that things work. Bureaucracies, in general, don't enjoy that. In those years, he cultivated habits that would later become legend. Precisely timed movement. An obsessive attention to supply. The practice of training sailors until they were bored, which is much safer than training them until they are surprised. He also gained the reputation of a man who didn't lose. Helpful on a battlefield, less. Helpful in a city where the king was afraid of his ministers, and his ministers were afraid of each other by the time he was appointed to command. Joseon's left naval district in the southwestern province of Jeolla. In 1591, Yi was 46. That age in itself tells you something. It wasn't a comet, it was the sun creeping up the horizon, steady and slow. He took command of a navy that existed more on parchment than in reality. Ships were leaky. Crews were underpaid. The idea of fighting on purpose had been gently retired in favor of preserving appearances. He quietly canceled that retirement party. He built new ships. He refitted old ones. He tested anchors and measured tides. And yes, he prepared the famous turtle ships, scovered roof warships, with a low profile and a mean attitude, though the turtle's exact configuration has become a national legend, so polished you can almost see yourself reflected in it. What matters is that he made his navy work. In 1592, the water warmed. Toyotomi Hideyoshi in Japan, flush with domestic victories, launched the first invasion of Korea. The Japanese armies poured through the peninsula like a tipped basin. The Joseon court did not, strictly speaking, handle it well. There was plentiful panic. There were accusations. There were discussions about ritual purity at exactly the wrong time. The king fled northward. It was all very expensively improvised. While the land fronts lurched, the sea turned methodical under Yi. He struck the Japanese supply lines. He did it early, and he did it without fuss. The early victories came stacked like small, neat stones. Okpo, Happo, Jekjinpo, and the larger blows at Sacheon and Hansando. These weren't cheerful fireworks. They were deliberate removals of the enemy's ability to eat, shoot, and move. And when the Japanese had to choose between fighting his navy and supplying their front, they discovered that ambition does not taste good when it's been at sea for 3 weeks. Naturally, this success earned him enemies. It's a kind of gravity of its own. There were fellow officers who resented being compared to him. There were courtiers who found him insufficiently decorous, especially when he sent back reports that sounded like arithmetic instead of adoration. Yi wasn't great at flattering people. He was also inconveniently honest. He had a habit of telling the court exactly what he needed and exactly how much it would cost. He kept shipping manifests. He kept personnel rosters. He kept receipts. That level of competence sits uncomfortably next to political theater, which prefers broad gestures and soft details. He also cultivated a rivalry with another admiral named Won Gyun, whose record at this point was less mythic and more ... intermittent. We should pause and peer quietly at the court, turning in its own circles. King Seonjo sat at the center, a man who seems in retrospect to have been composed mostly of nerves. He had inherited a country that had become very fond of factions, Easterners and Westerners, and then more cutely named sub-factions, and had developed the disconcerting habit of punishing competence when it came wrapped in the wrong political stationery. Ministers clung to influence like a robe in a strong wind, and they did not particularly enjoy field commanders who solved problems without asking for permission. It made them feel redundant, which they were, and they didn't like that. So we arrived gently at the question you came for. Why was Admiral Yi Sun nearly punished to death before becoming a hero? The short, drowsy version is that he refused to be stupid on command. The longer, sleepier version involves a double agent, an impossible order, and a court that wanted the world to be less complicated than the tide tables, suggested during the uneasy truce that rippled between the two invasions. Japanese agents went on pretending to be helpful. One such figure, his name curls and uncurls in sources, which is a polite way of saying that intelligence work Messi approached Joseon officials with a glittering story. He claimed he could lure the Japanese fleet at Busan into a trap, a perfect opportunity for the Joseon Navy to sail in and eliminate a major anchor of Japanese strength. It sounded too good. He knew the currents around Busan. He knew the positions. He had soundings and scouts. Everything he knew told him that sailing his fleet into that harbor was to gift trap it for the enemy. He said no. He produced reasons. The tides, the fortifications, the way the wind turned at that time of year, the width of the channels. He wrote it down like a sober man addressing other sober men. The court, unfortunately, preferred a plan that was flattering. It was flattering to imagine they possessed a spy so capable that the enemy would simply misplace an entire fleet. It was flattering to imagine the war could be tidily solved by giving a command and watching history obey. Ministers do like obedience. Orders came insisting that Yi perform the attack. He refused, politely, repeatedly, and in writing. The court then made its decision. It relieved him of command, arrested him, dragged him in front of the capitals, judiciary apparatus, and tortured him. There was a moment when a head would have rolled and a reputation would have been neatly erased, if not for a handful of men who understood what they were about to do and saw the cliff edge in front of them. One of them, a high official and historian named Ryu Seong, argued that executing the Navy's only undefeated commander was arguably not the ideal way to win a war at sea. It was the kind of basic arithmetic that had to be delivered with great delicacy. Yi was spared execution, but not humiliation. He was stripped of his rank. He was flogged. He was imprisoned. And then, in a twist that would be unbelievable if it weren't so administratively tidy, he was assigned to serve as a common soldier. He wore the rough, dull uniform. He stood guard duty. He bowed when told to bow. All the while, the court patted itself on the back for maintaining discipline. It's easier to be proud of rules when you're not on the water. We single quotes here for a moment. Imagine Yi at night as a demoted soldier under a thin blanket, while his battered back pulses with that dull hot ache that follows a public flogging. Imagine the little thoughts that come when you are not young anymore and you are asked to be, humiliated for reasons that feel too small to hold. He had a talent for patience, but patience has a nervous system. It can hurt. Meanwhile, his replacement Won Gyun took command of a navy that had been trained to a particular rhythm. Gyun didn't hear the music, but he pretended he did, which is usually worse. He promised action. He promised to deliver the attack the court had demanded, the way a salesman promises delivery next Tuesday. And yes, the Japanese were delighted. The trap had not been designed for Ye's caution. It had been designed for someone else's pride. This is the worst part of all of this, the compounding effect. A bad decision at court is not a single moment of wrongness. It is a pebble dropped into a pond that distorts everything around it. A skilled commander is removed. An inferior one is elevated to please a narrative. Supply lines once precise, become soft. A sober command culture is replaced by speeches, and speech does little, in the end, to resist iron and salt water. Before we move into the predictably unpleasant outcome of all this, it's worth noting that none of this made Yu grander in his own mind. In his wartime diary, the Nanjung Ilgi comes across as a man who processed fear the way he processed wind. With tight sentences and measured observations, he wrote about his mother's illness. He scribbled notes about how long it took a particular boat to make it across a run in rough seas. He worried about the men. He worried about his hands. He did not cast himself as destiny's favorite. Cast himself as a man in charge of a very long list. He was also, let's be honest, chronically inconvenient. The pageantry of humiliation didn't take. The men in the ranks noticed he still walked like a commander. He still checked things that other people forgot to check. Officers who had previously resented him found themselves quietly visiting his campfires, asking about matters in the Southwest, fishing for little pieces of advice. He had knowledge that stuck. You can demote a man, cannot demote the tide, and the tide kept behaving the way Yi said it did, and then the tide rose in a different way. The second invasion began in 1597. The Japanese came again with more ships, more determination, and more arguments among themselves about who was in charge. But the court saw the enemy massing, turned to its accused visionary, and realized it had invested its hopes in a man who could not steer. The navy, under Won Gyun, followed orders into a channel it did not understand, at a time it should not have chosen, and discovered precisely why Yi had refused to go there. The slaughter at Chilcheollyang followed. The Joseon fleet, which had been the main useful thing the court possessed, was largely destroyed. Won Gyun died in the chaos, as negligence often does, at which point the court sent for Yi again. Thing about ghosts is that they are not usually available. The thing about living legends is that they sometimes still are. He returned to find almost nothing left. 13 ships, hardly any stores, men who looked like winter, even though it wasn't winter. And if you're expecting a crescendo here, let's not. He simply did what he always did. He counted. He measured. He found where the current would be on a certain day, at a certain hour, and then he waited. But that is for the next stretch of water. For now, let's finish the circle to our question. Why was Admiral Yi nearly punished to death before becoming a hero? Because the court of Joseon had become addicted to the feeling of control without the practice of it. Because an honest report can look like an insult to a minister who prefers flattery. Because jealousy is not a modern invention. Because a good navy looks like a threat to those who don't understand how it prevents worse threats. Because the winds of 1597 blew as they pleased, and the people and palaces wanted them to blow differently. They wanted Yi to act out their courage. Instead of doing the quiet math that might save the day, we'll glide toward that quiet math next, the 13 ships in a choke point. The admiral with bruises that hadn't yet faded, the currents running like ropes around an invisible hand. It's a scene that became the stuff of patriotic dreams, which it probably shouldn't have. Attention. But again, people like stories where numbers become miracles. Ye, to his credit, didn't. He liked numbers. He liked the smell of wet hemp rope. He liked the way a crew grew calm when everyone knew exactly what came next. Before we let this part fade, a small human detail. In his diary, he often mentions illness and fatigue and small domestic worries tucked next to orders and tactics. These entries remind us that a man being dragged in irons into court is still in his own head, concerned about when the next letter from home will come. He noted the moon, he noted the rain. He noted a gift of persimmons. In the middle of a great war, he was the sort of person who remembered to write down that someone had been kind to him. And yes, that includes the person at court who argued against his execution. The kingdom owed him its coastline. The court owed him a basic apology. The court, naturally, did not send one. Let's drift over to the next royal fiasco, which is less a single moment and more a movement court factions chewing on each other while the country tried to stay in one piece. That is where Ye's near execution belongs. After all, not as an isolated cruelty, but as the inevitable outcome of a government that treated competence as a provocation. Settle back. The room is quiet. The story is not, but we'll keep it sleepy. King Seonjo reigned over a kingdom whose civil officials prided themselves on moral rectitude and wrote long essays to prove it. At their best, they were brilliant. At their worst, they were grand prize winners in the art of missing the point. Seonjo himself was a man made of caution. He preferred compromise so much that even his compromises had compromises. He enjoyed identifying the proper ritual response to a crisis, less so the practical one. Joseon's bureaucracy in the late 16th century had all the furniture of stability, hefty law codes, an established set of ministries, a class of scholar officials who had studied for this their entire lives. What it lacked was agility. When the crisis came, the state tried to argue with it like a pedant with a dictionary. The result was a lot of correct words and not enough horses. The factions didn't help. The scholar class had split into Easterners and Westerners, and then those split further like soap bubbles. These weren't sports teams. They were networks of mentorship and patronage, full of cherished principles and very cherished grudges. They disagreed about policy. They disagreed about punishment. They disagreed about whether the other side counted. As human, in a stable time, this can be managed by taking turns being sanctimonious. In a war, it's a way to set the building on fire and argue about who should call the fire. Brigade Seonjo's court was an anxious greenhouse for this sort of thing. You can imagine the halls, polished floors, scrolls hanging like quiet witnesses, courtiers drifting past like thoughtful ghosts. The king issues a decree. A minister writes a memorial asking politely if the decree could be less like that. Another Minister replies that perhaps the first minister has forgotten the teachings of the sages, and would he like to borrow a book? A third minister counts the number of bows done in the wrong place. Meanwhile, the enemy advances, and at the end of the day, everyone agrees that the real problem is the lack of respect for proper procedure. It would be funny if it weren't. Expensive Yi Sun out on the water did not belong to any of these factions in any deep way. He had mentors, he had friends, but he did not thrive in factional logic. It asks you to take sides before you count. Yi counted first. That is unnerving. To men whose main skill is taking sides, factions prefer reliable allies to useful ones. Ye was useful, so, of course, he was not reliable, at least, not in the way they measured it. The near execution episode fit neatly into this environment. The story of the double agent gave the court something to do that looked like decision-making. It allowed men who had never smelled tar to criticize a naval plan. The refusal by Yi wasn't just a refusal. It was an attack on their right to be obeyed. It was heresy against the church of their self-importance. So the punishment, when it came, was as much theater as it was discipline. They dragged him in front of the judicial ministry. They made sure everyone saw. That's important in their minds. Fear is a social tool. The fact that it also endangers the kingdom is a distant second concern. Seonjo, to his credit, wasn't totally oblivious. He listened to Ryu Seong, a sober minister who had an inconvenient habit of seeing the world as it was. Ryu had known Yi, advocated for him, and recorded later, in his own writings, the Jingbirok, or Book of Corrections, how the state should learn from its errors. The book reads like a quiet man's attempt to tidy up after a storm, sweeping, with a broom that keeps breaking in his hands. He lays out the practical failures, lack of preparedness, cowardly commanders who talked better than they fought, officials who obstructed for sport. He doesn't scream, he just lists. It's more devastating that way. We should talk a little about the personal side of Seonjo, because rulers are people, which is both comforting and middle of the night terrifying. Seonjo had a court with too many drawers. He enjoyed the feeling of maintaining harmony. He hated actually fighting for it. He fled from the capital when the Japanese entered it, which from a moral standpoint might have been defensible. Lived to lead another day, but from a psychological standpoint detonated whatever confidence the country had left in him. On the long journey north, he became the sort of king who wrote orders to seize more paper, as if memoranda could stop bullets. He also had a problem with heirs and the anxieties that attend them. Royal households aren't wholesome, and Joseon's wasn't a fairy tale. Primary wives and secondary consorts produced sons whose claims were a dance of status, timing, and politics. Seonjo's concern for his family's future blended with paranoia about those who might prefer that future to arrive sooner. The result was a man who saw threats in competent subordinates, because competence has a way of looking like ambition if you squint, even if it isn't. In district offices and navy bases, these moods trickled down. A commander needed letters stamped with the right seals. He needed to phrase requests so they flattered the right ministerial philosophy. He needed to pretend not to notice that a crate marked arrows contained mostly air. He was bad at this kind of pretending. He sent back crates with notes. He remarked on the shortfall. He listed it in counts that were too exact to be conversational. He had the soul of a decent quartermaster. That's not a compliment to the court. Meanwhile, the Navy suffered from hereditary bad habits. For decades, Joseon had been a land-first kingdom. Militarily, it nurtured an army and then fed it like a picky child, choosing only nice topics, like cavalry traditions and Confucian lectures. The Navy was treated as a coastal watch and a revenue service, not an arm of war. Ships were local. Crews were part-time, rotating in and out with the seasons, like a militia that preferred to fish. When Yi arrived and treated the Navy like a profession, he offended several time-honored forms of laziness. Training is hard on men who are used to coasting. It's even harder on their patrons. Let's drift to the geography for a moment, because it matters to what came next, and because it's soothing to trace coastlines with your mind. The southwestern archipelago of Korea is a scatter of islands and channels that behave at certain tides like a complicated clock. The water speeds up and slows down in regular ways. The straits pinch, the rocks hide. You learn these moods. This was his main heresy against the court. He learned natural law, not human status. When Seonjo's palace told him to sail a fleet into Busan Harbor at the wrong time, he felt not just strategic resistance, but moral resistance. The kind you feel when someone tells you to strike a match in a hayloft. It wasn't just risky, it was dumb. The punishment answered the wrong question. It asked, how do we make a point, instead of, how do we win? It satisfied the temporary hunger of petty men, and that is always expensive. His demotion to the ranks was supposed to be a public breaking. It was supposed to mark him as unclean, to frighten subordinates who might have entertained the idea of saying no to a minister. What it did instead was demonstrate the limits of performance. The war returned. Logic, speed, muskets, excellent morale, and a supply system that relied on control of the southern sea lanes. They sailed in armadas that looked from shore like new coastlines. Joseon's surviving officials peered out and realized, perhaps, that their arguments about how many bows a naval letter should include had not, in the end, fixed anything. Summoned you back because the performance had to stop. He returned not as a triumphant hero, but as a man with a job. He accepted what was left 13 ships and considered the tide. Here, it's worth noting a strange tenderness in how he operated. He didn't raise his voice much. He did not cultivate a terrifying mask. He didn't need to. Men in his presence understood that he was paying attention, and it is unnerving to be watched by someone who really sees you. They also understood that he was not trying to impress anyone at court. He wanted them alive. He wanted the ships to float. He wanted the enemy to make a particular mistake in a particular channel. This produced a kind of calm even, a kind of affection that you can't fake. One more courtly oddity before we moved to the battle hovering just ahead. When Yi was rehabilitated, no one admitted they'd been wrong, of course. They blamed circumstances. They blamed deceit. They blamed each other in polite ways. The court's favorite hobby was discovering that something had gone wrong and naming it without understanding it. After the disaster at sea, they named it tragedy. After Yi's return, they named it prudence. The reality, like the water under a hole, moved on without them. You might ask, didn't the king, having nearly killed him once, feel awkward? He may have, briefly, in the way that a man feels awkward when he runs into the neighbor whose snow he accidentally shoveled onto the wrong driveway. But kings do not thrive on awkwardness. It is dangerous for them to notice it. Seonjo did what kings often do. He erected the memory of his error into a narrative about his mercy. He spared Yi, after all. The fact that he had sentenced him first was allowed to recede in the music of the court. We're almost at the place everyone likes to talk about the 13 ships in the Myeongnyang Strait. But hold off, just for a minute more. The question of why the Nair execution is not a trivia point to be answered and tossed away. It is the hinge of something larger, how states survive disasters of their own making. Joseon didn't survive the Imjin War because its court was wise. It survived because a handful of people understood things that the court had forgotten how to understand, and they were allowed, barely and belatedly, to act. Yi was one of those people. He was almost not. The knife edge was real. If a different minister had won the morning argument, if the flogging had gone a little deeper into the muscle, if a different pride had needed feeding, we might not have a legend to talk about. We would have a story about a very competent man who died at the wrong time and a navy that went to the bottom. Let's drift there now, gently to the strait that moves like a pair of lungs, breathing in and out every 6 hours. The plans are made. The men are tired. The admiral is tired too, though he doesn't write that part down. The court is far away, inventing a new vocabulary for the same old failures. And out on the water, the enemy is coming in a great mass of confidence. Next, we'll watch how 13 ships and a man with bruises use the tide to make a point that even a king could understand. The Myeongnyang Strait does not look like a place where you would choose to fight someone larger than you. It is a narrow passage where the water behaves like a mill race. On a bad day, you can throw a stick and lose sight of it before it touches the far bank. On a good day, the eddies just make you nervous. Nyasunsin chose it precisely because it frightened people who didn't know it. He knew its tempos, knew the slack hours. He knew where a ship would come to grief if its helmsman panicked. The Joseon fleet, if we're grand enough to call it that at this point, numbered 13 warships Panoxian, broad and sturdy, built to handle rough water. There were some additional support vessels, fishing boats pressed into service, things that groaned when you asked them to turn quickly. Opposite them, the Japanese came with well over 100 fighting ships, not counting the vessels that carried rice, muskets, and morale. Numbers vary across the chronicles, as numbers often do when they're written down by people who had better things to do at the time, like not drowning. But no version of the count looks fair. Fairness, of course, is courses, not the point. Tactics are. He positioned his vessels where the current would favor him at the right moment. He let the enemy come into the throat. He taught his gunners patience. It's the hardest thing, patience, when the sky fills with sails and the air fills with powder, smoke, and your arm is screaming at you to throw the next shot. They waited to fire until the enemy was bound by the water itself. And then they fired in a rhythm that turned muskets into punctuation, marks and cannon into sentences. There's a temptation to make this heroic in a loud way. It works better as a quiet thing. Imagine the timing of it instead. The counting and the little delays to let the chaos set in. Men on the Japanese decks shouted and shoved. Ships bumped in the churn. Signals from flagship to squadrons ran into the problem that signals always do, which is that people have to read them while distracted by not dying. The current turned. The Joseon ships adjusted their angles like a row of shoulders, turning in unison. The shots landed where they were supposed to. And somewhere within all this, the enemy realized that their numbers had not been invited to this particular part of the fight. He wrote later that his own flagship was a target. Naturally, he stood visible on the deck. The commander on the field has to be seen, especially when his men have recently watched him demoted, imprisoned, and then brought back. Visibility is part of authority when you don't have the court at your back. An arrow struck his helmet. Splinters flew. He didn't change his face much, because he was that sort of man, and because making a big show out of not flinching ruins. The point of not flinching. As the day turned, and the currents with it, the Japanese attack lost coherence. Some captains tried to force the issue. Others tried to escape the narrow kill zone. He pressed where the water led him, then relaxed where it didn't. He did not throw away what he had just won by becoming greedy. There's a consistency about him, even in violence. He prefers safety and leverage to drama. That's probably why he lived as long as he did, which in his line of work was not exactly a given. When the enemy fell back, they were not just bruised, they were astonished. It's one thing to be beaten. It's another to be beaten by a logic that you didn't believe in when you woke up that morning. The Japanese command had to explain to its people how 13 ships had done what entire fleets were supposed to prevent. The Joseon court, for its part, had to explain to itself how the man it had whipped and sent to stand guard with a spear head, in the space of a few weeks, saved their coastline again. They didn't explain it. They pretended it made sense after the fact. The court excels at retroactive rationalization. We all do, in a smaller way. We tell ourselves that we saw it coming because the alternative is admitting that we were napping, while the house filled with smoke. Ministers who had urged Yi's punishment now found ways to praise his virtues without mentioning their own excellent efforts to erase him. The king congratulated him as if this had been a plan all along. and then they turned their attention to the next problem. Because problems are like officials. There are always more of them. This battle didn't end the war, of course. It did something more important. It ended the Japanese Navy's comfortable belief that the southern coast was theirs by right. It reopened the possibility of supply disruptions. It relieved pressure on pockets of resistance, and the Ming Chinese forces, who were doing their own difficult dance on the land. It turned the sea back into an argument that could be won by thinking. That's what Yi did best. He converted chaos into a place where thought worked again. Meanwhile, because this is a bedtime story about mistakes as much as it is about victories, the court returned to its primary devotion, itself. There were punishments to assign for the earlier naval disaster, many of them to people who, inconveniently, were dead. There were promotions to pass around, some of them to men who had learned the virtue of standing next to Yi without getting in his way. There were essays to compose about the appropriate ways to praise a servant of the throne without accidentally implying that the throne had needed him. That would be rude. Ye, in his diary, did not write fiery manifestos about his greatness. He wrote about repairs. After Myeongnyang, he inventoried the damage. He listed holes in planking and the number of good planks to fix them. He wrote about nails. He wrote about weather again. He thanked a subordinate for something small. He mentioned pain in his back without elaboration. He reminded himself to send word to a temple for ritual offerings, because victory makes you respectful. If you're the sort of person who counted on a lot of things going right that you couldn't control. At court, there were other anxieties. The war was a mirror held up to Seonjo's reign, and he did not like what he saw. He had lost a capital. He had fled. He had punished the wrong men and trusted the wrong rumors. His heirs were growing up under a sky of rumors and frustrated ambitions. The Crown Prince Gwanghae was competent in a way that frightened people. Which is to say, he looked like the sort of person who would not accept elegant excuses. The king's later son, born to a favorite consort, complicated this picture. Joseon's palace suddenly had a familiar disease. Too many people with plausible claims to being absolutely necessary. We'll get to that drifting tangle later. Haunted prince who tried to steer a middle course between two empires and was punished for being right too soon. For now, let's stay on the water, where logic still holds. After Myeongnyang, the Japanese had to rethink how they moved. Did not immediately collapse. They were still formidable. They still had muskets, organization, and very sharp swords. But now, they had to respect a strait that did not previously depress them. And they had to imagine a mind waiting on the other side of every narrow passage. Counting quietly, he carried on. He escorted supplies. He harassed. He refused to be drawn into heroic nonsense. He chose battles where the geography did half the work. There is an unsexy genius in that. He was, as ever, an irritant to people who preferred valor to victory. He did not die on principle. He arranged things so that the principle lived and the enemy died when possible. It's a good policy. It didn't make him popular at court, We can leave the boats rocking for a moment and drift back inland. To a man in his 70s in Osaka who had convinced himself that he was one good campaign away from rewriting the map of East Asia, Hideyoshi's dreams can wait just a little. They're loud and slightly ridiculous, and we'll enjoy them more if we approach quietly. For the purposes of Admiral Yi, what matters is that the Japanese strategic picture was now smeared. The line of supply depended on the coast being friendlier than it had any right to be. Yi made it unfriendly. It's the war on land, with all its sieges and betrayals, gained a new texture. Uncertainty answered by more uncertainty. And yet, if you had walked through court in those months and asked people what mattered most, you might have been told about the rivalries between ministers or the proper posthumous title for a dignitary who had died of stress without leaving a truly satisfying apology. This is the terrible beauty of courts. They are insulated from the things that matter until it is too late. Then they discover a new thing that matters a lot: survival. And then, naturally, they make it worse. The Navy would remain underfunded. Yi would keep writing his small lists. The tide would keep running. That's the rhythm we're in. It's an almost soothing chaos because it repeats. It feels safe because you know what these people will do. The court will court. The sea will see. The admiral will count. And the enemy will learn or not. When we meet Hideyoshi shortly, he will present himself as a man who mastered chaos through ambition and grit, which is true up to a point. He did a remarkable thing in unifying Japan. He did another remarkable thing in looking at a map and deciding that this was not enough for a Sunday afternoon. He did not have a great relationship with reality. He cultivated messianic logistics. He believed that knowing he would succeed was the same thing as being able to succeed. Men like that, history informs us gently, acquire a lot of food. But tonight, we're still rocking on our little plank on the water. You can hear the clunk of the mast, the creak of a line, the cough of a sailor. There's tar and fish and salt. There's Yi at the rail, keeping the weight on both feet, hands behind his back, listening to the current as if it is telling him a secret. Somewhere inland, a minister is drafting a very stern memo about pronouns. Somewhere far away, a man in silk is admiring a sword he will never draw. And in the long hours after midnight, a demoted hero who has just been rehabilitated is not sleeping much because he's running through the angles for the next encounter. Heroes are mostly people who lied to themselves convincingly about how tired they were. Next, let's take a slow walk into Hideyoshi's head, which is a gallery of bright paintings hung slightly crooked. He's funny if you keep your voice down. He's also tragic, though he would hate that word. He wanted everything and got that for a minute. Then he wanted more and met a navy that preferred arithmetic. Breathe in. The room is still. We're going to pad softly into a castle in Osaka, where a Toyotomi Hideyoshi is planning an empire from under a roof that he earned in a lifetime of climbing. He'd come up hard peasant origins, a knack for fixing things, a face that his enemies loved to mock and his friends learned to follow. He had organized, improvised, and charmed his way into being the man everyone had to please. He collected tea bowls and provinces. He was unstoppable until he wasn't. Unification is intoxicating. It convinces you that obstacles are just elaborate compliments. Hideyoshi had controlled Japan with a mix of grace and savage efficiency. Land surveys, sword hunts, rearranged vassals. He was accustomed to turning out the drawers of the country and finding what he needed. The warriors he had hardened in unification demanded occupation. Idle samurai are like bored cats, ornamental until they start breaking things. He needed to point them somewhere. He pointed them north, across the water, toward Korea, and beyond, to the Ming heartland. He offered them China as an afternoon's walk. The plan had energy. It also had holes. Japan was very good at moving armies across Japan, and less good at moving them across a sea and maintaining them through a winter in someone else's fort. The men were brave. The ships were many. The muskets were loud. The math did not care. Yi Sun, who absolutely did care about math, made sure the math was loud. 2. Hideyoshi's personal life, meanwhile, had started to warp under the pressure of being a national event. He had lovers. He had wives. He had a late-born son he'd oriented. This small child immediately became the reason that many grown men did not sleep well at night. If you've ever seen an entire political system scan the horizon for a steward to a toddler, you know the feeling. Organizations claim to value stability. They mostly value not being blamed. Hideyoshi, worried about the future, created a council of regents to manage the realm until the little boy could wave a fan convincingly. He peopled it with men who distrusted each other in a way that would be useful later. For other people, on the front line of his submarine dream of conquest were two men who detested each other, Kanishi Yukinaga and Kato Kiyomasa. One was Christian, diplomatic, more flexible. The other was old-school samurai, sharp at both ends and allergic to compromise. Hideyoshi loved a balance of threats. He put them adjacent and watched. They competed. Hosen collapsed in the first months of the invasion like a tent in a wind. The Ming moved. The war tilted back and forth with sieges, brokers, and betrayals. In a series of peace talks that felt like a board game played by experts who had lost the instructions. All this is exciting if you speed up your voice. We won't. What matters tonight is the gentle pressure of logistics. Hideyoshi's armies needed rice. They needed gunpowder. They needed messages to cross the sea faster than rumor. They needed a Korean peninsula that would behave like a corridor instead of a landscape with its own chaotic personality. And they needed a coast unbothered by a man who understood tides better than he understood flattery. He tried to solve problems with declarations. He was good at that. We will conquer China. We will punish the insolent. We will supply this campaign by making it so. The letters have a ring to them. The boats did not care. The rice did not sprout on command in foreign fields. Soy sauce does not carry itself. The Japanese Navy, competent, but not specialized for prolonged, literal warfare against an enemy who refuses to play your game, did not manage to erase Yi. You can, of course, try to kill him, and they did. He was annoyingly alive until almost the very end. Hideyoshi's domestic arrangements grew more brittle. The older he got, the less he tolerated the idea that anyone else was good at anything. He had reduced potential rivals with vigor. He had exiled some, executed others, and rearranged. The rest? That's one way to run a state. It's also a way to ensure that when the war becomes difficult, no one is in a position to tell you that you've made a mistake. It's the same problem Seonjo had, filtered through brighter armor. Men like this memorize the feelings they get when someone agrees with them and mistake it for wisdom. On the ground in Korean, in the alleys of the courts in Hanzung and Beijing, negotiators tried to do alchemy. Could Japan accept being recognized by China in some special way that made Hideyoshi feel big without actually flaming the world? Could Ming accept peace that looked like not losing, as long as the language was flattering enough? Could Sacheon survive being the table on which everyone else played chess? The answers were not yet, not really, and possibly. The table legs held. Ye's continued naval harassment punctured this diplomatic souffle. It guaranteed that the Japanese could not pretend to be comfortable. Trying to hold a walled town wouldn't have to fight a resupplied army every single time. It did not save the countryside from devastation. Nothing did. The Imjin War is many things. One of them is a long, slow bruise across a people who had to watch their homes become kindling for history. We should say that quietly. It matters. This was not a story of heroic exceptions only. It was a story of rice paddies trampled in families. Scattered back in Osaka, Hideyoshi grew ill. His body was catching up with a lifetime that had run itself ragged. He made arrangements. He issued commands that read like the confident plans of a man who cannot imagine disobedience after death. He urged loyalty to the child. He tied knots in a rope he would not be there to hold. When he died in 1598, his aura did not. Then they remembered that someone else would have to be obeyed now. That someone else had not been chosen so much as surrounded by adults, ready to carve at him like a roast. It would end in a different unification under a different name and a quieter approach to the outside world. All this brings us back to Ya's water. In the months after Hideyoshi's death, the Japanese command had to extricate itself from a situation it had made more complicated than it had any talent for resolving. Some units left as if leaving a party past midnight, silently and with the shame of spilled wine. Others fought at the exits. The final clash at Noryang would take someone we have gotten used to having, but not yet. Let's keep him with us, eh? A little longer, afloat, reciting to himself the work to be done. We'll travel north now, toward Beijing, and into the Forbidden City, where the Wanli Emperor learned to be absent in a very present way. He had started with promise, guided by tutors who believed in responsibility. He discovered, swiftly and permanently, that his highest pleasure was not showing up. He was that student who aced the first assignment and then decided the rest of the course didn't deserve him. The Ming state was a great machine that had learned to run without joy. Its tax system was creaking. Its internal politics were a polite wrestling match between the emperor and his grand secretaries. The Wanli Emperor wanted to choose his heir according to his personal affections. His ministers preferred ritual. There were long debates. There were longer silences. His Majesty took the elegant route. He stopped attending meetings. For years, decades, he signed less. He stared out windows more. It was passive resistance, imperial edition. When the Imjin War arrived, the Ming court had to act. The cost of not acting was watching a very energetic neighbor carve the first slice of the empire's flank. So they sent generals. They sent money made into grain, and grain made into burdens. They sent orders that arrived on paper to be relevant, yet through the slow torpor of the capital, some competent people moved. Song Yingchang handled logistics like a man who understood that men cannot feed on honor. Ryu Seong led forces with a brusque practicality. They went to Korea and tried not to lose. Fighting in Korea was not an imperial fantasy. It was cold. It was muddy. Cities were broken, recaptured, broken again. Armies were chewed. No one felt rewarded. They measured their days in carts, successfully brought through a pass, and nights spent under canvas that leaked. When news came that Admiral Yi had shredded a convoy or prevented a coastal push, it felt like breathing through a smaller hole. Not safe, but less dangerous. The Wanli Emperor, on receiving dispatches, responded in the manner of a man who finds his role both beneath him and beyond him. He released funds. He withheld approval. He sent presents. He moped. His relationship with reality was essentially that of a landlord who lives in another city. He was not malevolent. He was tired. He found the ritual obligations of kingship claustrophobic. He probably needed a nap. He took one that lasted most of his reign. The Ming intervention helped save Joseon. It also helped bleed Ming. War happens like that. The bills come due later, and they don't look like hospital receipts. They look like regions where the tax collectors are nervous. Like border garrisons, where the soldiers keep borrowing trouble and never return it. Like resentment stored like dry timber for the next match. Back in Hanyang, court rituals resumed, even as war limped on. The Ming presence was both rescue and humiliation. Joseon was a civilized state in its own right. It was not fond of being treated like a misbehaving younger cousin, but it was fond of not being erased, so it swallowed and took notes. Ryu Seong kept writing the corrections. He suggested reforms, training, preparedness. He had the air of a man who sees the hinge creaking and applies oil while everyone else writes poetry about the door. The tragedy of men like Ryu and Yi is that their victories produce less gratitude than requests for more of the same. Competence is punished with workload. It is rewarded with micromanagement by people who do not understand how any of this works. Ye needed wood, iron, and men. The court sent letters. The Ming generals needed discretion. The court sent envoys with instructions. Everyone preferred dignity to speed. It's a recurring problem. The Imjin War also generated small human debris in the corridors. Captured civilians moved like shadows. Minor nobles lost lands and discovered that their identity was more portable than they had thought. Bridges, while the gentry argued about how many times to bow before township shrines, we know this because habits are hard to drop. People record the things they understand. Ye's diary notes the weather. Ryu's corrections list bureaucratic errors. A peasant remembered where he hid for 3 days in a gully with his mother. It all knits into a blanket of memory that is somehow never quite warm enough. We should return to the water one last time, because that is where Yi lived and where he was to leave. The Japanese are retreating. The Ming and Joseon want to ensure that the retreat is a humiliation that discourages a return. The Japanese want to leave by sea the way they arrived. Everyone understands that this requires one more shove. We're approaching Noryang. The Battle of Noryang came at the end of 1598. Grim and necessary. Admiral Yi and the Ming Admiral Chen Lin coordinated a plan to fall upon the Japanese as they tried to extract their forces. It was a night fight, smoky and confused, full of flames dragging reflections across black water. Ye arranged his positions. He did not need many speeches. He had become his navy's habit. The fighting churned. It was fierce and inelegant. If you listen closely to the scene, you can hear steel against wood, the heavy wet thuds that don't belong in poetry, and then, in a loud, unimportant moment that history sets in italics, an enemy projectile struck Admiral Yi, an arquebus ball. A small piece of lead with a perfectly democratic aim found him where years of enemy attention had not. He was wounded badly. He told those near him not to announce his death. Keep beating the drums. Keep the signals steady. Keep the shape of the plan. He died that night. His fleet did not. It is both too neat and true to say his last command was composure. He was the sort of man who understood that a plan is also a performance. Men believe as well as obey. He had been a study in steadiness for years. He ended with steadiness. The battle finished as it needed to. The Japanese retreated. In pain, the sea remained, as always, neutral. When the news reached the court, there was a thick pause. It's the pause people make when they realize that someone they depended on is not available, and that the proper rituals of praise are a poor substitute for a solution. There were posthumous honors, there were titles, there were poems, they were sincere and not useful. The country now turned to other tasks, like reconstruction, blame, that favorite sport. The Japanese warlords, left with a small boy and a group of regents, fell into a familiar pattern of cutting each other into managerial pieces. Tokugawa Ieyasu, patient and crisp, would take the larger piece. Japan would turn inward for a time, which was a relief for its neighbors, but not always for its own people. Joseon, for its part, had to choose a future and characteristically refused. The Crown Prince Gwanghae had administered ably in war, often showing a nasty competence that made courtiers nervous. He preferred balance between Ming and the rising Jurchen, a policy that would later look prescient. He also had the misfortune of not being born to the king's primary wife, and of having a younger half-brother born late to a consort with powerful friends. The palace filled with the kind of whispers that have ruined countries since there were palaces. Gwanghae took the throne. He governed with care and suspicion. He rebuilt. He saved grain. He spent less time hunting than his forebears. He favored realists. Naturally, the court called him cold. He had that haunted look that you sometimes see in men who learned early. That competence is a reason to be resented. He navigated between a Ming that still expected tribute and a Jurchen state that would soon call itself Qing and expect the same, with greater vigor. He did the obvious. He tried not to get crushed. In this, he was ahead of his time. The court, as ever, found this uncomfortable. There is nothing dignified in being careful in two directions. It offends the soul. It is unpoetic. It is also frequently the only sane course. A faction of officials, calling itself righteous and assisted by opportunistic generals, staged a coup. The Injo Restoration in 1623 pushed Gwanghae off the throne. He was exiled to Jeju Island. He lived out his days under a sky that is beautiful and completely indifferent. He died in a quiet that he had been denied in life. The new regime promptly made a series of decisions that invited disaster because naturally they did. The Ming fell. The Qing came. The new Joseon court wrapped itself in moral superiority as a blanket in winter and discovered too late that it was not actually wool. The country suffered invasions that could have been mitigated. It learned, again, that prestige at court is a commodity that can be traded for the kind of certainty that keeps your children alive. It made that trade at bad rates. Yi Sun-sin's posthumous presence threaded through all this like a reminder. Every time the court tried to pretend that rhetoric was strategy, somebody would mention the admiral. Every time a minister grew red in the face about ceremonial irregularities, a small, scandalous thought would arise in someone's head. How many planks did he write down again? How many nails? That is to say, how many things did he fix because he felt like it was his job, and not because it made anyone feel grand? Dynastic oddities drifted through these years. Joseon's royal marriages were exercises in avoiding incest. On paper, and in arranging political alliances in reality. The palace favored certain clans and then unfavored them with the air of a person rearranging flowers and discovering that this made everyone sneeze. Babies died. The bloodline was fragile because life was fragile, and the court soothed itself with rituals that, if we're being honest, it had begun to mistake for results. We can soften the light now, because we're almost done. We've watched the admiral be nearly executed, bring a fleet back from non-existence, hold us straight with 13 ships, and die at the right time for history, which is to say, the wrong time for him. We've watched kings act like anxious men, and anxious men pretend to be kings. We've watched a conqueror in Japan believe that wanting something is the same as building it, and an emperor in China believe that ignoring something makes it go away. We've watched sensible ministers try to lay boards across gaps, while everyone else argued about the proper width of gaps. Let's end where we began, with the admiral who wrote things down. His diary, the Nanjung Ilgi, is not a trumpet. It's a ledger of a mind trying to make sense of days that put heavy hands on him. He noted illnesses. He recorded dreams sometimes, because a man at war dreams and is embarrassed by it in the daylight. He wrote about his mother's death and his inability to attend to her as he wished. He wrote about dinners, quiet, and whether that made everything feel like a damp shirt. He wrote about sending small gifts to temples, not because he expected the gods to tip the scales like gamblers, but because he was a man of his world, and his world believed in balance. In the centuries since, he has become a monument. Statues exist where he didn't. Museums fill displays with artifacts that are cousins of his era's tools. Every generation finds in him what it needs. Some see the perfect soldier, loyal and uncomplaining. Some see the perfect civil servant, precise and incorruptible. Some see the perfect father of the nation, which is an unfortunate category that flattens men into symbols. He was more interesting than that. He was a man who got bored if he didn't fix something. He was happy when he could measure. He was suspicious of the kind of eloquence that keeps getting you killed. Why was he nearly punished to death before becoming a hero? Because courts are places where reality has to arrive wearing a disguise. Because the people in charge of words needed to believe that words were enough. Because other men wanted his job without his work. Because refusing to walk into a trap is insubordinate when the trap flatters a minister's imagination. Because after enough paperwork, cruelty feels like administration. The miracle is that the court survived him. It did, of course, and then it did what courts do. It took credit. It renamed things. It renamed him. It made his death meaningful in the way that officials try to make a funeral meaningful. The speeches are more for the survivors than the dead. And maybe that's fine. Maybe meaning is, in the end, what we make of someone when we try to behave well in their presence. Even after they've gone, if you're falling asleep now, take with you this small, unglamorous image. It's you counting nails again after a battle, hands black with tar, back still sore from a far-off flogging, watching the men coil ropes as the sun goes down. He doesn't look especially noble. He looks busy. The sounds around him are domestic. Knives, on cutting boards, a cough, laughter like politely stifled relief. The sea smells the way it always does. Somewhere in the capital, a minister is practicing. A phrase, he does not care. He carries on. That's the whole story. He carried on. And if you wake up later, wondering whether he would have enjoyed being a legend, the answer is probably no. He would have enjoyed a clean workshop, a tidy ledger, and a war that wasn't necessary. He did not get the last one. He made the first two anyway. That is heroism, though he would have disliked the word. Sleep well. The court will still be there in the morning, worrying about whether your blanket is the correct color. The sea will still be turning under the moon. And somewhere in the space between, a man who once stood on a deck with his hands behind his back will keep counting, because someone has to.